Hello, everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today. Because today we are continuing our book recommendations series that we throw out to social media. And today, as you could guess from the title, we are talking about where to start with Grimdark, the fantasy genre known as Grimdark.
Yeah, I'm interested to get into this, and when it comes to where to start with an episode on where to start with Grimdark, I was thinking that it's a good idea to try to define the subgenre of Grimdark and get a sense of what it actually means, because people throw this term around all the time, and it's not really clear to a lot of folks what it means. It just differs from person to person, and there's an awesome blog post from back in 2017 by friend of the show, Mark Lawrence.
Friend of the show?
Author of Prince of Thorns, Book of the Ancestor, and many more.
You might hear that a few times today.
Yes, you're going to hear his name a lot in these recommendations. So a man who's written a lot of really incredible Grimdark, and even he, in his blog post, wasn't exactly sure how to define it. He said, the process of defining Grimdark to be not a war of words, but a war for a word. There are those who use Grimdark as a pejorative for a vague group of things they dislike. There are Grimdark aficionados who see the term as descriptor for an aesthetic that requires the presence of a number of distinct elements, which may include moral grayness, bleakness, and nihilism. And there are some, an apparent majority, who just see it as a setting on a control knob relating to general levels of violence and ickiness. And yeah, so
ickiness.
Yes. And I've always kind of seen it as this, not that I think of myself as a Grimdark aficionado, but I do align with that idea of it being mostly about moral grayness, bleakness, nihilism, and for me, cynicism, hopelessness.
Right.
Those are big things there. But what's interesting that Mark Lawrence sought to do on here is he actually had a giant poll where he had people rate how grimdark they thought a bunch of different novels were. And we might refer back to that poll because a lot of the things toward the top, not surprisingly, are going to get recommended in this episode. And it's just a really interesting exercise for a sort of nebulous term, but one that, as you'll see when we go through our recommendations, there's a lot of common ground on what people think is Grimdark. And I'm excited to get into this because I think maybe we'll learn a little bit more about what Grimdark means, and we'll also, of course, get the chance to talk about a bunch of awesome books. And that's what I love about these recommendations episodes. No further ado, shall we get into this, Charles?
Let's get into it. I'm excited. Let's see if we can kind of figure out what people think Grimdark is through these recommendations. You know, that to me is going to be very interesting. This is a unique twist to our recommendation series. Usually we do like fans of a certain author, but this is the first time we've really gone the route of this kind of nebulous genre in fantasy. So let's see what the Twitter sphere has to recommend to us today.
Yes, and we'll go down this list and try to hit on as many comments as we can.
Let's do it.
The first one that's coming up is from Dark Portents. A booktuber and a podcaster over at the Legendarium Green Team podcast, stopped by and started off with besides first law, which is a great a great way to start this off because we'll get into Dark Portent's actual recommendations in a second, but this came up a lot as people almost take for granted the idea that, okay, like if you're thinking Grimdark, the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie, one of our absolute favorites, it's just taken for granted. And I mean, the Grimdark name and subgenre in part come from, or at least its popularity, not the origination of the term, but its popularity in part comes from Joe Abercrombie's Twitter handle, which is at Lord Grimdark. And a lot of people think of his work, and it will come up a lot still, for sure, as being kind of the quintessential Grimdark series.
Right. Yeah, no, it's funny because, I mean, you even threw a Joe Abercrombie GIF in the tweet announcement calling for recommendations. So it's no surprise that people treat the First Law as almost a given for this recommendation series, and are going to recommend books even further. Yeah, so I think Dark Portents, nailed it with that one. And let's get into the books that he did recommend.
Yes. So from at D Portents, besides First Law, Priest of Bones by Peter McLean, Crimson Empire Trilogy by Alex Marshall, and Blackwing by Ed McDonald. And Charles, you've probably heard Blackwing come up a few times now. It definitely came up in our recommendations for fans of the First Law series. And it is one of my, I would say it's my go-to underrated recommendation for fans of First Law. And I would say I'd also call it, because it's almost synonymous at this point, and it's also my go-to underrated recommendation for fans of Grimdark. And I think it's a great place to start with Grimdark. The books are they're a lot shorter than the First Law series. They have an awesome morally gray protagonist in Reinhold Galharo, and I really enjoyed reading them. They're also first-person point of view, and you really get in the mind of this morally gray protagonist. Awesome series. Highly recommend that.
You've recommended that one a few times. It's come up a few times, and we've done enough of these book recommendations where once I start to recognize a book title or an author, they go way up to TBR. So this one actually has me quite excited because, like you said, people do kind of sneak it in their recommendations, but consistently. So Blackwing by Ed McDonald is one that interests me quite a bit.
Yeah. And I'll say that Dark Portents also went on to say probably Beyond Redemption by Michael Fletcher. And we got a second recommendation for Michael Fletcher's work from Bender, at Jack Claver, who said, and it'd be remiss to not tag at Fletcher MR. His Beyond Redemption topped Mark Lawrence's list of Grimdark books, and then he topped that with Blackstone Heart. And then he did tag Michael Fletcher, and Michael Fletcher stopped by to say, I'm not sure Beyond Redemption is a good starting place for ... well, anything. And I responded to that by saying, that makes me want to read it more. So this is one that has on that, there's a 5-point scale, I think it was, for a 5-point scale for that Grimdark rating thing that Mark Lawrence did, and Beyond Redemption scored a 4.63, which puts it 0.2 above Prince of Thorns, which is, we'll certainly talk more about Prince of Thorns, but Mark Lawrence's work that's often considered one of the defining staples of Grimdark. So Beyond Redemption by Michael Fletcher.
It's not a great place to start anything, but you know what? That to me is almost like an endorsement for the Grim. I know. Like, that is like Grimdark in itself. It's like, oh, you wouldn't start with this for anything. It's like, okay, that in itself embodies the spirit of Grimdark. So I can appreciate that. And, just another book on my mountain is TBR. But thank you, Fletcher, for stopping by. It's pretty awesome. Speaking of artists, authors coming by, leaving their mark, I made a recommendation, and I'll just go quick because it's a series that everyone will come up a lot, and that's I had to throw out Prince of Thorns because that was perhaps my introduction to the grimdark
Yeah.
genre, and that series starts off very dark. Like in the first couple scenes, some very intense scenes are going on, and the character himself is very much this anti-hero, I guess you would say. He's very he breaks the law in a lot of ways, does a lot of unsavory things, but there's still these qualities about him that make him such an interesting character. And I went for the tag. I tagged Mark Lawrence and he dropped the like, which is greatly appreciated. So thank you, Mark Lawrence, for stopping by. Yeah, Prince of Thorns. Gotta love it.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk about it more as we move on, but just wanted to put that out there.
Yes, Charles. I'm glad you got that out there. I mean, Prince of Thorns is, like you said, go-to. It's way up there, and I think that it's an interesting balance of being highly, highly grimdark while still being very accessible, which is what makes it such a great where to start place. Because, I mean, we had Michael Fletcher saying, well, I don't know if you actually really want to start here.
Right.
Hey, maybe it would be. We haven't read that one yet, so maybe it would be too much. I even saw Bender at Jack Claver kind of being like, it'd be remiss not to tag him because it's so grimdark, but maybe there were some reservations about that as a starting place. While Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns, there is some stuff like content warning stuff that make it, tough for some people to read. Things like sexual violence are in there. And that being said, I think a lot of people have found Prince of Thorns to be highly accessible as grimdark goes. So I understand why it is a go-to for you, Charles, and it's definitely one for me too.
Well said. Well said. I agree completely.
Yeah. And Bender did have another rec, which was Black Company. And he said, good to start at the beginning. And we'll get more of these Black Company shout outs for sure. So we'll get into that more. Charles, and Bender also mentioned Library at Mount Char, which we haven't read. So it was a standalone. But Charles, let's talk a little Black Company because you have read that.
Yeah, I read Black Company a while back, and a lot of people consider it the genesis for the grimdark genre. So a lot of characters that you get today, like a Glokta or a Tyrion or a Jorg, characters from these famous series, you're not going to get so much of that, but it's a very much a militaristic fantasy novel, and it's very much it tries to be more realistic to the realities of war in the ways that a lot of modern, more considered grimdark fantasy novels are like. These characters are kind of morally gray. They don't always do the virtuistic thing. They're not heroes like Aragorn or Gandalf. They're hero. They're like rugged band of mercenary kind of heroes. So in that respect, it's very interesting. And when you consider its place in the timeline and what came before it and what came after it, if you're someone that enjoys that aspect of reading fantasy, then it's a super interesting, a must read at that point, because you get to see who influenced whom and how this kind of springboarded into modern fantasy. It's still very, very much classic fantasy in like its prose and the plot. It very much reads like a Lord of the Rings kind of book, but the actual content and the characters in them are a bit more into this morally gray vibe that modern fantasy authors are gravitating to right now. So it's a really interesting transition piece. And it's a bit older, so if you're kind of turned off by older fantasy writing styles, you may not get excited about it, but anyone into militaristic fantasy or interested in grimdark at all should absolutely read it.
Yeah, it's interesting, Charles. In classic hasty fashion, I jumped right to reading Joe Abercrombie and Mark Lawrence and Rebecca Kwong's work and all this stuff that's a lot more modern. And I didn't really start at the beginning, as Bender said.
Right.
I think this is something that's been kind of an ongoing theme for you and I on FTF is you dragging me back to read some of these more classic works. And then, you know, me kicking and screaming a little bit, but then getting to the place where I do often really enjoy the context. So I'm curious, as someone who hasn't read Black Company here, would you say it brings that cynicism and nihilism and hopelessness at all to it? Or is it more the violence and
It's a bit
morally gray
nihilistic,
characters?
but it's a bit nihilistic. And again, I read this years and years and years ago, so I'm no
Mm-hmm.
longer an authority on the story. But I do remember, you know, the characters being, you know, very hardened, very down in the dumps, very like gritty, you know, mud spattered warriors kind of thing
Mm.
that are fighting on a campaign, and they may not always. It's kind of like it's almost kind of like he was writing morally gray characters really before it was a trope, right? So you get the sense that
Mm-hmm.
these, so they're not like flat out villains or pontificating on like, oh, how humorous is it that I'm a good guy but I'm doing these bad things right now, you know, like they're not like doing, it's not going anywhere that far. That's why,
Yeah.
like, I don't even know if I would consider it grim dark, but I would consider it like the crack in the wall that led to the, you know, opening
Yeah.
of Grimdark, right? It's like, oh, you can write characters like this? How interesting. What happens if I take it a step further? What happens if I make the themes about this? You know, like that's what Grimdark I think more embodies, whereas you get the flavor of it and you get the genesis of it in Black Company. So it could be a good place to start in that sense, but it's not going to give you the full sense of what like a modern grimdark fantasy novel is like. It's very much a more traditional fantasy story. But if you like that and you are like, oh, I love Lord of the Rings, you know, I love Wheel of Time, maybe I should read Grimdark, but I don't want to go all in, then this would be a good segue, I think.
That makes a lot of sense, Charles. And I think to put it all in context, the Black Company, the first book was published in 1984.
Okay.
This is Glenn Cook, by the way, the
Mm-hmm.
author, if we haven't mentioned it yet, or mentioned him yet. And then A Game of Thrones, which also I think of as a springboard toward the grimdark subgenre,
Sure.
is that didn't come out until 1996. So
Yeah.
we're talking with this kind of like moral gray, gritty fantasy. We're talking Black Company came over a decade before A Game of Thrones would come out. So
Right.
that's it makes a lot of sense that a lot of people think of it as the beginning.
Yeah, and honestly, it reads like something that came out 10 years before Game of Thrones. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just gives you a sense of like people think a lot of characters in Grimdark are like witty and super violent. And, you know, think about what that character written in 1980 fantasy world might be like. And you get more of a sense of how this is more of a beginning than it is a this is Grimdark. It's like, oh, this is starting to become Grimdark. There's a difference.
That makes sense, Charles. I'm interested because it feels like the kind of series that we're going to cover at some point on this
Right.
show, right? It's
Mhm.
uh, and I'm really interested for the context it'll provide for the genre. And if you're the kind of person, like Bender said, who likes to start at the beginning, it makes a lot of sense to start there.
Yep.
So let's keep it rolling. We did have a recommendation from our friends over at Fiction Fans Podcast.
Yes.
And yeah, and when it's tweeting and it's coming from that's at Fiction Fans Pod, their account, it is Sarah who's making this recommendation. And she said, I think Seraphina's Lament by, she tagged at Bookworm Blues, that's Sarah Chorn, is considered grimdark. Actually, and that book I loved and would definitely recommend. Her prose is poetic and beautiful and so evocative. So, Charles, you and I have not read this book yet, but Sarah Chorn is a two-time SPIFBO semifinalist. That's a self-published fantasy blog off Mark Lawrence's, the competition that Mark Lawrence runs for self-published works. And it is interesting to hear Sarah describe a grimdark book as poetic and beautiful. right? It's not really the
Right.
type of thing that we think when Grimdark comes to mind. It's
Right.
interesting.
Right. And just knowing Sarah and her personal tastes, like she loves Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman, um, those authors. I'm trying to remember who else she had read recently and praised, but she was more on the fence about books like Game of Thrones and about The Gentleman Bastards and books like that, which are more grimdark. And she tends to lean more towards like Terry Pratchett. So I was like, oh yeah. And when she because she originally said nothing came to mind for her for the grimdark genre
Right.
on the poll too. So I was like, okay, that kind of aligns with my idea of what her tastes
Yeah.
are. So when she drops a grimdark rec, and it's from a pedigreed spiffbo author, and it's also described as having beautiful prose, it's like, okay, all those pieces are coming together for me about how it could be a grimdark novel that's also recommended by Sarah from Fiction
Yeah.
Fans. So I'm actually very interested in reading it. I'm just the fact that it's recommended by Sarah and it's grimdark. It's like, okay, this I have to read it.
Yeah. I've been going back and forth a little bit on Twitter with Sarah because she keeps saying she's seeing all the Joe Abercrombie love and she hasn't read that series, and she keeps saying that she wants to read it. And I've been same kind of thing as you, Charles. I'm like, I know your tastes to some extent, and I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And we love Abercrombie so much.
Oh,
It's
yes,
like
we do.
we want to just go out and recommend it to everyone, but I'm like, I'm really not sure what you're gonna think. So I said to her at some point on this thread, I'm like, I'm curious to hear your take once you get around to Abercrombie. So we'll be keeping an eye on Sarah's takes on Grimdark and on Joe Abercrombie. But for now, we know we have one recommendation from her, and a recommendation from her is a recommendation from us for sure.
That's well said. So what is the next book as you navigate us through this Twitter thread so deftly?
The next book comes from Fantasy Book Nerd, and that's at Fantasy Book Nerd. And good old FBN said, yes. This is on my TBR, Anna Stevens, The Godblind Trilogy. And Anna Stevens has come up before, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, on our book recommendations for Joe Abercrombie, so that's always a good sign.
Yes.
And and yeah, she is an author that I've had recommended to me before. I think I've read some very positive reviews, but don't know a lot about it. But FBN writes awesome reviews and has awesome just thoughts on the fantasy genre. So another one that we can't speak to personally, but is recommended from someone that we know is going to come out there with awesome recs.
That's well said. Fantasy Book Nerd is a frequent contributor to these threads, and they're always appreciated when a review pops in, and I've been taking notes at the series that get recommended. So I have not heard of this book, the Godblind Trilogy, but I am definitely interested.
Godblind.
Godblind. Oh, I put in an extra O in there. Thank you. The Godblind Trilogy by Anna Stevens. Definitely one I'm going to investigate very soon.
Yep. All right. Next up, we've got Benjamin from At Literature and Lo-Fi.
Good old Benjamin.
Good old Benjamin, who managed to not recommend The Lies of Locke Lamora.
That was a surprise, but he thinks that also it's probably also a given that that's just going to be something, no matter what the call for the recommendation is, it's going to be at the top of his list.
Yeah, and Benjamin said, I think it's already in the schedule, but Ash and Sand he tagged at RNell2, and that's Richard Nell. And yeah, we have, I'm not positive when we're going to get to it, Charles. You always know the schedule a lot better than me, but Ash and Sand, we have a copy of that from Richard, and he seems like a super nice dude from our interactions on Twitter, and I'm excited to get to it because Benjamin, from what I can tell, Benjamin doesn't seem to be a huge fan of the grimdark subgenre. I had an exchange with him once where I was like, do you like any books that are grimdark? This was before this, obviously.
Yeah.
And he mentioned Ash and Sand, and he keeps telling me, like, just read the first chapter and then you're not going to be able to stop. So I'm like, okay.
Wow. That's high praise.
Yeah. So I've avoided reading it, Charles, because I know I don't want to get too off schedule for
Right,
it. But,
right.
but in due time, in due time.
In due time, indeed. Yeah, that's good to know. And I mean, appreciate Richard Nell for reaching out to us about that, and Benjamin for recommending it, because that's high praise. And you know, I think Benjamin's recommendations and reading schedule is kind of aligned with ours a few times. So if he's recommending it, then I'm definitely going to be paying attention, because I feel like we're on the same page with a lot of series. Although he is on the fence with the First Law trilogy right now, but you need to finish it, Benjamin. You just read The Blade itself. Read Before They're Hanged, read The Last Argument of Kings, and then we'll, you know, see what your thoughts are after you've experienced the whole thing. But it's good to hear, and thank you for the rec. And yeah, and all in due time. All in due time.
Yes. And Benjamin had a really interesting review of The Blade itself.
He did.
You could tell he was very ambivalent about it. So
yes.
Yeah, I'm excited to see his thoughts as he continues with the First Law series. And that's probably a good seg to Mask Reads, at Mask Reads, who runs an awesome Discord, by the way, that folks can join to talk some fantasy. And Mask Read said, First Law is an obvious one. It's like the same thing, right? Like,
right.
Okay, well, like,
who's going to be that guy that recommends First Law?
So then, well, it'll be us too, because we're going to highly recommend First Law as a great place to start. Mask Reads also went on to say, I enjoyed Broken Empire and Red Queen's War, Mark Lawrence, as well as Raven's Mark, Ed McDonald, and that Raven's Mark is the series that starts with Blackwing that we talked about earlier.
Right. These are some big hitters coming out here.
Right. And seeing Raven's Mark appear alongside Mark Lawrence's work and First Law, Charles, another time for you to start paying attention.
Most definitely.
So... And at some point, Charles, I think it's a good idea for us to actually flesh out why First Law is a good place to start with Grimdark. It does feel like it's something that gets taken for granted, but yeah, shall we?
Yeah, we can, unless someone specifically recommended it. I think everyone's recommending it in passing, so we can just get into it. I mean, there's a reason that we put Abercrombie as the GIF and the call to action for these recs, and there's a reason he goes by the Twitter handle of Lord Grimdark, and he's just kind of embodied this image. But listening to him talk about it, right, Dylan, you have some perspective on Abercrombie's reflection, because we talked about Mark Lawrence's thoughts on what Grimdark is, but I believe Abercrombie's kind of weighed in recently on his thoughts, at least as it relates to his own work.
Yeah, well, I'll get into that. I'll start with saying, especially the original First Law trilogy, I think really characterizes the Grimdark stuff from that piece of the definition that I said I gravitate toward, which is that moral grayness, bleakness, and nihilism. Mm-hmm. I think that Abercrombie's original First Law trilogy, there's a reason why that's consistently called Grimdark and why he's Lord Grimdark, all those kind of things. But I think now that I see him as evolving as an author, and I think he's getting even more complex with how he thinks about these things and how he presents his characters. And I don't think he wants to be kind of caught in this box of everything he writes has to be like that.
Right.
And he's said more recently that I mean, the GIF I dropped was, some people call it grimdark, is what he says. I believe this was from an interview with Murphy Napier, who's a booktuber extraordinaire. And he kind of said, like, yeah, I don't really like that term grimdark. He's obviously got a Twitter handle, but I think he sees it as this, I'm stuck with it because it's my brand and it's been this way for so long. So I think he just doesn't like feeling trapped. I don't know him or anything, but he doesn't seem to be liking being trapped in this idea that everything he has to write has to be nihilistic. And I think we've seen, I won't get into detail, but we've seen things in the standalones already, Charles, and I think that there's things in his later work that just, obviously the Abercrombieisms are going to be there, and his perspective on people and all those kind of things that he does through his characters is gonna have these grimdark elements, but I see him playing around with themes and character work and things like that in a way that I just think of it as evolving, and I don't think he wants to be constrained by that grimdark label. But of course, First Law, especially the original trilogy, I think fantastic place to start with grimdark, and I mean.
I mean, one of the characters is a torturer who was tortured, and he's musing about all the ways in which he tortures people, and you're like, okay, this is like how I see Grimdark. It's like you have a scene where like a lot of violence is happening, there's a torture going on, and this character is having musings to themselves, and they're actually kind of humorous. So you're like, oh, this balance of finding humor in these dark moments and having characters that aren't virtuistic and pure as the heroes, as the protagonists, is one that to me defines the genre. And I can see why Abercrombie's pulling away, because there is more to his work, and a lot of other fantasy authors as well, than what's on the surface. There's a lot of context, there's a lot of complex themes and things, and sometimes when you're pigeonholed in a specific genre, it's hard to write your way out of those expectations. So I see where Joe Abercrombie's coming from, and I respect that. But I also think it's a terrific example of these kind of witticisms and nihilisms that can be found in a grimdark fantasy book. Like they're so, I'm going to use the word delicious in the First Law. Like they're so tasty when they happen, and they're so good, and that's why I would recommend it too. I recommended Mark Lawrence because that's where I started, but Abercrombie is another fantastic place to start. And I think if you aren't jiving with the Blade itself or with Joe Abercrombie's work, then there's probably a lot about the Grimdark you may not vibe with. It's not necessarily everything, but it's a good litmus test for the genre, which is why I think it's also a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad you brought up the humor, because that's something that I always felt with Abercrombie's work, that even though it is very grimdark and cynical, all this kind of stuff, he brings you back level with that humor.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I think that's why, because so many people think about Joe Abercrombie when they think grimdark for good reason, but in this poll, the Blade itself came in, I believe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th. So that's, I mean, obviously that's high, but for a person who's basically synonymous with grimdark at this point, he's finishing below a lot of books. And by the way, that includes Godblind by Anna Stevens is up there. So that's another great endorsement for that series that FBN brought up. So a lot of these series by other authors that are not known as Lord Grimdark are considered even more grimdark. And it might be that humor in part that I think makes Abercrombie's work feel a little less dark.
Well said.
And in some ways more accessible because of that.
Right. And that makes sense to me, because, he's not necessarily setting out to write a grimdark novel. He's writing a novel that has a lot of grimdark tendencies.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, all right. Let's keep it rolling then.
Let's do it.
We've got a recommendation from Yellow Birdie at YellowBirdie721, another person with an awesome Discord that I'm part of and recommend joining. And Yellow Birdie said, I think the Trader Baru Cormorant is grimdark, kind of like a question mark after that. Also, the 5th season, they both seem grim and dark to me. Also, my favorite reads.
The 5th season, I haven't read it. I know you have, Dylan, and you can answer this question for me, but I didn't realize that it was considered like a grim dark novel. What do you think about that as someone who's read it?
So it's interesting because I when I heard this recommendation from Yellow Birdie, I had that instant reaction of like, oh, I don't think of that as grimdark necessarily. But then I thought about it. I was like, that totally fits. It totally
Ah.
fits. I mean, it's a very I think the part of it is N.K. Jemisin has in no way really embraced to anything I've seen, has in no way like embraced the grimdark subgenre as what she sees herself as writing. But the story takes place in an extremely dark world and with really messed up things happening. Huge just exploitation of people, abuses of power, oppression, all these things, and some horrible things happen. And one of the things I love about N.K. Jemisin's work is she is not afraid to go there and have just awful things happen to her
Oh my
characters.
goodness.
Yeah, I mean, it is, I've been, since our first ever Friends Pitching Fantasy, I've been espousing what I love about the fifth season and just the Broken Earth trilogy in general. So a fantastic recommendation from Yellow Birdie. And I do think it works for Grimdark of how I see it.
Interesting.
And yeah.
I mean, fifth season is so high up on my TBR right now. I just cannot wait to get into it. And the moment that the show presents the opportunity to read it, I am jumping on it because I'm very excited about it. And I've heard enough people recommending it. I've heard enough of it creeping into just my everyday life that I'm like, man, I gotta pick this up. So that's a great rec, already way at the top of my TBR, and just affirms its position. And I see here that Yellow Birdie went on to comment like, oh, like if you read the Trader Borrow Cormorant, I hope I didn't butcher that too much, they go on to say, I love seeing people's reactions to the ending. And those kind of comments always get me excited too. And I love when an ending is controversial. Usually in fantasy, when an ending is controversial, I tend to at least appreciate it, if not fully enjoy it. So that's a promising comment for me.
Yeah, and Yellow Birdie wanted me to do a reaction thread for when. So I told Yellow Birdie that Trader Borrow Cormorant that's. Oh, I hope I get the author right. I think it's Seth Dickinson. I'll double check that at some point while you're talking.
Sure.
And it's sitting on my bookshelf right now behind me, actually, Charles,
Nice.
as we record. So I was kind of like, it's once it's on that bookshelf, that highly increases the chances I'll get to it relatively soon. So
Yeah,
I'm
the
excited
author
for
is
that,
Seth
and
Dickinson.
who knows? Maybe I'll do a reaction thread. I've never really done that before, but yeah. So shall we keep rolling here, Charles?
Let's keep rolling, Dylan. Who is next on the thread?
We were honored to have Edward Gwynn at Edward GDM. Yeah, a booktuber from the brothers Gwynn alongside his brother Will, and also son of the book we're reading at this very not son of the book, son of the author who wrote the book.
Son of the book.
Son of the book that we are reading right now. John Gwynn's The Shadow of the Gods, and we're always pumped. Edward's such a nice dude and does such awesome work over at the Brothers Gwynn, so we're always pumped when he stops by on Twitter.
Absolutely.
And and he said Ed McDonald, Peter McLean, Larry McMurdy, Adrian Selby, and you're noticing some repeat offenders of committing grimdark over here. So Ed McDonald again, that's Blackwing, and I think Charles, just another fantastic reminder.
Hey, it's appreciated. I've watched a lot of the Brothers Gwynn videos. They do a lot of like recommendation series, and they take turns like pitching books to each other. And a lot of their recommendations, I'm like, oh yes, I've read that and I love that. So it's like I have a feeling that our tastes align very closely. And so when I see, not only do I see these names that I recognize, but names that have come up multiple times today, Ed McDonald, for example, sign me up, guys. Like, I'm ready to go.
Yeah. No, I'm pumped for when we do get the chance.
And then you replied with that amazing GIF of Abercrombie. I don't know how you do this, but you created a GIF of Joe Abercrombie holding a book by Ed McDonald in this response.
No, by Larry McMurray.
Oh, Larry McMurray. I'm sorry. Larry McMurray. Yes, and that's just amazing. I think I had to come in and be like, dude, mad props.
Yeah, so Larry McMurray, that he does westerns, and Joe Abercrombie was in a lot of ways inspired by Larry McMurtry's work, just his character work, it sounds like. And Ed has been really recommending these books a lot, and it's basically at the top of my not fantasy TBR, which unfortunately doesn't a lot of things get taken off of the fantasy TBR before the not fantasy TBR, I think. But anytime I'm in the mood for a Western, someone who inspired Joe Abercrombie and has Edward this pumped, I definitely want to get to it. So yeah, I had to make that GIF. It was perfect.
Very awesome job, very timely. And guys, if you aren't on Twitter and following us at the FDF Podcast 1 to see these Abercrombie GIFs in action, you are missing out. This man is making custom, fresh GIFs from fantasy authors.
Yeah, I also gift from their Brothers Gwyn channel. Yeah. I gift Edward and Will and sent that to him later in the thread. Yeah. So, yeah, and Edward's like, that is surreal. Yeah, I'm always having
you gifted me once. That was a bit wild. I wasn't ready for that.
I did give you.
Yeah. It's weird when you see a GIF of yourself.
Yes, I hope most people are honored. I know.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes they're mortified, but I think most are honored. So we'll keep it rolling here.
Yes, thank you, Edward and the Brothers Gwyn, for making such great content and for stopping by and giving a few recs. Well made, and they're definitely aligning with the names that are sticking with my brain in this episode for sure.
Yeah. Well said, Charles. So next up, we've got David DeCero, at David DeCero, who is a booktuber, and David recommended the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence, of course. Another classic, the Empires of Dust trilogy by Anna Smith Spark. And Anna Smith Spark is someone who's come up before Charles and I, like book recommendations for First Law trilogy.
Oh, good.
This series, this series finished actually right above Anna Stevens's Godblind at 4th in the rankings of most Grimdark. That's the Court of Broken Knives, and I think I'm gonna double check this. I think that Anna Smith Sparks' Twitter handle is Grimdark themed as well. So I'll pull that one up in a second. But
sure, I can read their follow-up. David DeCicero went on to comment, the prose in the Empires of Dust trilogy is poetic, beautiful, and strange, which I find interesting. It has a distinct flavor to it, and because of that, I think you'll either love it or hate it. But she has absolutely earned the title the Queen of Grimdark. That is fine praise. No doubt. And then I appreciated when they dropped the First Law trilogy. They said probably decent entry level Grimdark. The tone is surprisingly light and funny at times, which is what we were working our way towards when we were describing it a little earlier in the episode. And I think that's actually an interesting way to pitch it as an entry level Grimdark. It's like, hey, this series is actually quite humorous and funny, and very often so, even though it is grimdark. And that's an interesting distinction for Abercrombie.
I agree, Charles. And yeah, that Queen of Grimdark reference was a reference to Anna Smith Sparks' Twitter handle, which is at Queen of Grimdark. So
got it. There we go. It all makes sense.
All right, let's keep it rolling. We've got a recommendation from Nick Borelli at Nick Rev WS is basically Nick does reviews, and we got a lot here. We'll probably home in on one in particular.
Yes,
again,
there's one I'm going to stop you on, but we can go. Let's give all the recs, and then we'll do.
Give them all. Yeah. Heroes Die by Matthew Woodring Stover.
That's the one.
Yes. The Black Company by Glenn Cook. Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. The Winter Road by Adrian Selby. The Heresy Within by Rob J. Hayes. Beyond Redemption by Michael R. Fletcher. The Obsidian Psalm by Clayton Snyder. Thank you so much, Nick, for all these recs, and I know which one Charles is going to want to talk more about.
Absolutely. I mean, Heroes Die. Guys, this is a book that I always felt like I had read it, and Dylan, you had read it after I did and recommended it, but that was kind of where it ended. And I didn't know anyone else that had read the series, and I gotta say, in the past couple months, I've been hearing more and more about this book. It's been popping up here and there on the Twitter sphere, and I couldn't be more excited. I think it's making like this cult comeback, and I want to read it on the show very soon. Who knows? It might sneak into my next Friends Pitching Fantasy. I'm that serious about it. I just think there's murmurings on the internet. I think people are interested in this book and recognize it as an underrated gem. And just to contextualize it in Grimdark, I mean, the main character, I don't know, like he's definitely like a gritty character. He's almost like he's like an action hero like you would expect in the movies, but he's also a little bit more he's a bit more nihilistic than that, and he's a bit more rugged than that, but the action in this is so good, and it's a book about violence, which we've said in other episodes on the show, so I won't get too into it, but Heroes Die is a great recommendation for maybe even people that lean more towards science fiction that want to get into Grimdark, maybe people that are more interested in action, like and just entertainment, than necessarily this huge, thick, doorstopper of a book. And it's a great book to pick up for that as well. And the main character is just so interesting, and the action in this book is so unique, and I just enjoyed reading it. And to hear it being recommended now by Nick Borelli, which is I was impressed by this. I was like, this is an impressive list, and so like to see Black Company right after that, and then some authors that we see multiple times, Rob Hayes and the like. It's super interesting, and no, I think Heroes Die is a really good rec because it's not too off the deep end in terms of like, subverting all these different fantasy tropes, or it's not trying to be over gratuitous, although it is violence, but it's not like gratuitous violence. And for those reasons, I think it would be a great introduction to Grimdark. You can go harder if you're feeling it, and you could also pull back and try more action-packed fantasy novels instead. So it's a good litmus test in that respect. So great rec.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said. It is very accessible. I think it's a book that hasn't gotten its due. I've read Heroes Die as well. Charles has always brought more energy and passion around the book, but I really like it too, and I'm excited for when we do one day get to read on the show, and I really appreciate all of Nick's recs here. I think a lot of great places to start with Grimdark. I think that action with Heroes Die is a good thing that'll keep people's attention and their energy up and things like that while they're reading in a way in which just something that is all out cynicism might not do. So I think that's part of why it might be a good place to start. And
well said.
That's awesome. Yeah.
All right. Well, we got a lot of names here. Let's see how fast we can blaze. We want to get as many of these in as we can here, but when we don't want a 2-hour long episode. So let's see what we got.
Yes. So we got a recommendation from Run Along Womble at Run Along Womble, and another awesome reviewer out on the Twitter sphere. And they recommended for a standalone, Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie may be a good starting place. And this is an interesting one, Charles. We just finished up our second part of our Best Served Cold episode discussions, and I think it's interesting. I don't know. I see why this is an awesome recommendation because Best Served Cold is so much more fast paced than
Yes.
like starting with the First Law trilogy. And like there was some conversation that sparked from this kind of about that, where it's like usually I do recommend the Blade itself as a place to start, but also we have some folks like Benjamin, who we just mentioned earlier at that interesting review, who kind of get ambivalent, particularly about like the slowness, I think, about
Yeah.
the Blade itself. And not a lot does happen in that first book. You and I,
Yes.
Charles, always
Yeah.
love just spending time with those characters,
Yeah.
but it's tough. And Womble said something in a later comment, which was, I don't like telling a new reader you must read the first 3 books of something first. The First Law ending is brilliant, but you need to be invested on the way. And that's just very
Yeah.
insightful.
So
I
well
agree with
said.
that.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
yeah.
That's
It's
a good
interesting.
point.
So-
If you're really trying to get someone hooked on Abercrombie and you know it's going to be like luck just to get them to read one book, then this might not be
Yeah.
a bad place to go. I personally recommend reading Abercrombie all the way through because there's so many Easter egg moments in Best Served Cold. You certainly don't have to read the First Law trilogy. And I think Run Along Womble presents some absolutely spot on, fantastic reasoning for why you might start with
agree.
Best Served Cold. But as just an Abercrombie fan, I'm like, you gotta read it from start to finish. But this is actually a great rec for Grimdark. Just to start with Best Served Cold is an interesting idea I had not considered, but I see it. I see it. It's a
I see
really
it
good
too.
perspective.
Yeah. Next up, we've got Jody from WNS Book Club. That's at WS_Book Club. And Jody said, Black Company was an early favorite of mine. And that's Witty and Sarcastic Book Club. Awesome. Yeah, awesome reviews coming from Jody over there. And another recommendation from Black Company from someone that we love the work they're doing. So,
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited for when we get to it. And makes a lot of sense as a good place to start in context.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think you'll find some interest in it just from a like historical, intellectual perspective, and
Yeah.
then as much as you'd get out of like the actual book itself. So if that's not a reason to read it, I don't know what is.
Well said, Charles. Next up, we've got Behind the Pages at Behind the Pages 1, who she's another reviewer, awesome supporter of the show. And Behind the Pages said, Prince of Thorns was my introduction to it and got me hooked. And that's always, we've said a lot about Prince of Thorns and Mark Lawrence's work, such a fantastic place to start. And it's always good to recommend the thing that you feel passionate about and that got you hooked. It sounds like this was basically your experience too, Charles.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Next up, we've got Rod Milligan at Rod Milligan. And Rod said, it's an obvious one, but A Song of Ice and Fire kickstarted my appreciation for Grimdark, as I'm sure it did for many others. And it's interesting. There's probably a lot we could say about whether or not A Song of Ice and Fire is Grimdark, but I see it as holding the place that I feel like Rod is indicating, which is the thing that taught a lot of us, including myself, that fantasy was not just this like high fantasy Tolkien inspired world with clear heroes and villains and things like that.
Right.
I know that things like the Black Company were doing this before A Song of Ice and Fire, but for me, someone who didn't get into the genre until introduced to A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, this was kind of, I think I would say that, I think I said it in this comment here, the Game of Thrones show is what kicked off my love of fantasy and sent me down a path toward being particularly inclined toward Grimdark. And Charles, this is Grimdark is something that's very near and dear to my heart. A lot of my favorite series are Grimdark, and I think a lot of it is because I got into these like morally gray characters and complex, just like moral ambiguity and things like that, realism from A Song of Ice and Fire. And so much has been said about it. I don't think we need to go into detail.
No, I just want to say that this is a fantastic recommendation. I think A Song of Ice and Fire is a great place to start. And this is one of the most inspirational series that I've ever read. And it's the reason that this show exists. We've said that multiple times. So can't recommend it highly enough. And it's got such a great balance. The characters are amazing. And there's no like good guy or bad guy, which is super interesting about the story. It's like, wait, how do you win? How does a story end? It becomes less and less clear as it goes on, which is a very grimdark thing to have. There's like shocking moments of violence and sexuality and things like that that are also kind of hallmarks of the grimdark genre, where you're like, whoa, that's kind of wild. And that in itself is very entertaining as well. And it's all wrapped under his beautiful writing. You know, I don't think he needs much more praise than that. I mean, he's one of the most famous, respected fantasy authors of the modern age. So can't recommend it enough.
Agreed. Next up, we've got a suggestion from Lord Grumpy Darkling.
Oh, Lord Grumpy Dark is here? Wow.
I love how that's your reaction every time.
I mean, it's exciting, you know. You can never tell what that guy's up to, and
yeah,
it's just he's kind of like this legendary figure who comes and goes in our lives, and the fact that he stopped by is interesting. What did he have to say?
He asked, "Will you be branching out into the grumpy dark genre, or will this be exclusively grimdark?" Went on to say, if you're willing to go grumpy dark, then I recommend Daughter of Flood and Fury by Levi Jacobs. And yeah, we love Levi Jacobs'
Friend
work.
Of the show,
we
Levi
love
Jacobs.
Daughter of Flood and Fury. Yeah, was on for Friends Creating Fantasy recently. I responded to Lord Grumpy Dark. Oh, and Lord Grumpy Dark dropped an incredible gif of pop superstar Olivia Rodrigo. So props to Lord Grumpy Dark for that.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I said Daughter of Flood and Fury would be my top recommendation for where to start with Grumpy Dark as well, because Lord Grumpy Dark is a huge fan, and I don't think anyone else is talking much about Grumpy Dark per se. So I think whatever Lord Grumpy Dark's reading is probably the go-to.
No,
for
the first time I heard the idea of Grumpy Dark was in our interview with Levi Jacobs, and he said that to me, and my brain just like short-wired for a second. I was like, wait, what? Grumpy Dark? And I think it's brilliant because Daughter of Flood and Fury does walk that line, you know? And there's something, it's one of those things like, I don't know what Grumpy Dark is, but I know when I read it. And this is an example. It's like, that is Grumpy Dark. It's very action-packed. The action, it can be quite violent. The characters are not all virtuistic and holy like a Gandalf character, but it doesn't get nihilistic. It doesn't get like subversive. It doesn't get super gratuitous with its violence and blood and gore and stuff like that. So it's a great line, and I think it's highly entertaining read, and I want to read more of the Grumpy Dark genre.
Yes, and as a place to start an accessibility thing, I think that that pace of Daughter of Flood and Fury is something that makes it super accessible. It's short. It's YA too, which means accessible for more age groups than, let's just say, I'm not recommending Prince of Thorns or the First Law series to anyone under, let's say, their late teens, right? But you can recommend Daughter of Flood and Fury safely to some younger folks, and maybe that transition to, that's a great line from Levi, the Grumpy Dark idea. Just a little bit of edge, a little bit of kick to a little bit of that grittiness, but staying true to form to this more
PG-13 kind of.
Yeah. Exactly. And, it's YA. I don't know if there's a lot of YA grimdark. There is the Shattered Sea trilogy by Joe Abercrombie.
Right.
So, it's interesting. I don't know if I'd call it grimdark. But anyway, let's we'll keep it rolling.
And I believe Daughter of Flood and Fury, you can, download it for free on Kindle Unlimited and, stuff like that.
You can, yes. And we love Levi.
We love Levi. So check them out.
So next up, we got a recommendation from Maria Blackrain at M Blackrain, Empires of Dust by Anna Smith Spark. So just another one to keep in mind there, Charles.
Yep, I'm starting to remember the name, Anna Smith Spark, and I am going to be watching that with great interest, and it's definitely creeping up the TBR.
Yep. Next up, Lord Samper's Library at Lord Samper recommended the Try Glenn Cook's Black Company series for some early Grimdark, maybe even earliest Grimdark. So these kind of things, Lord Sampers is tuned into that context about Black Company, and another, hey, if you want to start at the beginning, this might be the place to go.
Great. Yes, exactly.
So, yes. Next up, we've got a recommendation from Bullet at Grimdark Cthulhu. And Bullet, you like that Twitter handle? It's a good
I
one.
do. Yeah.
Props.
So you know you gotta be listening. They got
Bullet.
Grimdark in the Twitter handle, so we gotta
true.
pay attention.
Yes. And true to form, recommended, I would say start with the First Law trilogy.
Yes.
I mean, it went on to say Glokta is such a brilliant character and all this Glokta praise happening. So appreciate it. Boy, you know we feel the same about Glokta. I see, Charles, you popped onto Twitter to say that we love Glokta. Awesome rec.
I said parentheses as a character because there's some morally gray stuff going on. It's like to say we love Glokta as a human being is a bit complicated, but to say as a character is 100% true.
Well said. Yeah.
So, great.
Both described said that the First Law trilogy consumed them. So, I mean, I know
great.
what that feels like. It's such a great series.
Absolutely.
Then we got a recommendation from Jesse Bird at Mr. Brainley, the Prince of Nothing series by R. Scott Baker. It might be, let me see if I can, it's Baker. Bakker. And went on to say it can be pretty unpleasant at times. Imagine if Nietzsche wrote Lord of the Rings, if Aragorn was Paul Atreides with less humanity. And that's a trigger warning for sexual violence and misogyny, though. So this is one that I think goes way on the gritty and dark side of Grimdark, because this was second in Mark Lawrence's most Grimdark poll. And the Darkness That Comes Before got a 4.57 out of 5 in terms of how grimdark it is. It sounds like a lot of grittiness and a lot of pretty messed up things happening. Sounds like some nihilism. We've got Nietzsche in the mix. So I think that, and I've heard this, it's very philosophical. I think that Baker has some maybe graduate school education in philosophy. Don't quote me on that, but that's what I've heard about it. So yeah, if you want to go real dark with your start, that might be the way to go.
I do sometimes. I do. So that interests me. I like shocking every once in a while. I find it entertaining. Yeah. But not everyone does.
Me too. It's just know what you're heading in for, it sounds like we've got Jesse Bird saying. So that's an awesome rec, it sounds like. And then we've got Tyra Phillips at Tyra_lean with 2 N's. I'd say Mark Lawrence, but I'd suggest starting Red Queen's War and then move into Prince of Thorns, which is interesting, Charles. We've both read Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence, and we've read Prince of Thorns and that Broken Empire trilogy, but we haven't read Red Queen's War yet.
We have not. It's come up a few times in this thread too, and I'm like, and Mark Lawrence, friend of the show, of course, liked my recommendation of a series on this thread. So, definitely on the TBR. There's so much more Mark Lawrence that I'd like to read on the show, and we will get to it in time. And Red Queen's War is way up there.
We will, and if we need any more of a recommendation, we got one from R at RJ Crondon, for Mark Lawrence's work, that is, who said I started with Prince of Thorns. And,
me too, R, me too.
Yeah, so did, yes. And sounds like R from our exchange after is getting into book 2 right now, King of Thorns. So I'm excited. I don't know, maybe he already has read it because this thread was from a little while back. So I hope you, if you're listening, I hope you enjoyed King of Thorns. Is an awesome series.
Absolutely.
By an awesome author. Next up, we've got Sasan at Days and Worlds, who said the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin would be my first choice. I don't think I felt the same bleakness anywhere else yet.
Wow.
And that's the thing. It really does have that bleakness. I just don't, for some reason, I didn't think I don't usually think of it. And this is why we do this, like reach out to all these other folks and let them stop by and
it's changing my impression of the book, and I have to read it. I have to read it. Pitch it already on Friends Pitching Fantasy.
Oh, you mean for the second time?
Yes.
So,
just not with Patrick Rothfuss's
the Kingkiller
Chronicles. Yeah. That was a tough one.
Yeah, that was a tough one. Next up, we've got Happy H at Happy H 2021, who recommended Grim Company, Luke Skull Trilogy. I think this is another one that did come up on our book recommendations for Joe Abercrombie, if I'm remembering correctly. So definitely one to stay tuned to, but Charles and I haven't read that one yet. Next up, we've got Lady Umu at M1Lu, who said, how about the Nevernight Chronicles by Jay Kristoff and the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence?
Wow.
Yes.
Nice.
We love the Book of the Ancestor. That's actually my favorite of Mark Lawrence's novels that I've read. You know, I love everything I've read by him, but Book of the Ancestor and Nona's story and just... and it's a little... what's interesting is, I would say, a little... I don't know. I don't really think of it as necessarily being grimdark. I think it could be considered that for sure. But I'll say that it got a 3.08 on that grimdark ratings thing from Mark Lawrence, which kind of puts it as like, in my eyes, you could call this grimdark, but it's not the grimmest or the darkest. And I think that
might make it a great place to start, though, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's where I was going. Gotcha. So I think that's a fantastic rec, and it's kind of like read the Book of the Ancestor and then see, like, was the grittiness and the darkness doing it for you, or you want something a little more cheerful? And hey, if the grittiness was doing for it, you might go even darker with something like Prince of Thorns.
Yeah, Prince of Thorns is way more grimdark than Book of the Ancestor, but they're both terrific works and both great places to start with both grimdark and Mark Lawrence.
I totally agree. Next up, we've got Steve the Bookworm, who said, Steve the Bookworm, openly Puerto Rican, at Sandman_Slim 101, who said, and Steve's a book blogger, by the way, over at Before We Go blog, which I'm a part of the Before We Go blog team as well. And nice. Steve said, The Black Company, and which we've heard a lot about, and The Falcon Throne by Karen Miller. And I don't know much about The Falcon Throne, but
me neither.
I said that, and Steve said the usual suspects of Grimdark wish they'd written something this grimdark about Karen Miller's The Falcon Throne. So that is high praise, and I'm interested for when eventually we get around to that.
All right. Well, that absolutely, and it's good to see one of your fellow teammates at Spiffbo out there. Very exciting.
Yeah. And Charles, can I know you're probably watching that time. I am too, but no one recommended the Poppy War, no, except me. I'm like so upset by this. The Poppy War. So okay, I did my own quote tweet in my personal account because I was like, come on. The Poppy War. Come on, everyone. The Poppy War by R.F. Kwong. Rebecca Kwong is... I know, I'm sorry if I'm sounding... You all gave amazing recs, but I do really want to talk about the Poppy War a little bit here, Charles. And I think part of what makes it, for me, such a great place to start for Grimdark is how fast-paced and modern it feels. It's just like the whole series just moves at this blazing fast pace. We've got this incredible modern feeling dialogue from the way that Rebecca Kwong writes the dialogue is, I don't know, it's refreshing. And it is extremely, I think, grimdark in how cynical a lot of the way the world is built is. Just the same kind of thing, not same, but some similar themes are explored with that, like oppression, and then in this book, like racism and acculturation and things like that are explored so deeply in that trilogy in a way that is extremely complex with a lot of moral ambiguity. And I haven't even mentioned Rin, one of my favorite characters I've ever read about. And talk about that moral grayness with protagonists. When I think moral grayness with protagonists, of course, I think about things like Joe Abercrombie's work. And I also, one of the first things that comes to mind is Rin from the Poppy War, who is so complex. I feel like Rebecca Kuang depicts Rin with just so much, I almost want to say care, like understanding of this character and how the experiences of this character have made her into a morally ambiguous figure, while never backing away from going into that bleakness, from having all these moments where Rin does interesting and dark things at times. Extremely intriguing character. And just something that's really interesting is the book kind of shifts you from, I don't want to say too much, but there's just a point in the book, and Charles, I know you know what I'm talking about, and folks who've read it will know, where there's a shift in tone. And I think in some ways it's jarring for people, but in other ways it might kind of drive home this grimdark feeling even more. And yeah, I think it's a fantastic place to start with Grimdark, because it's just, I think it's an incredible novel, an incredible series, but also because of that pace and accessibility with the like modern feeling writing style and dialogue and these morally complex characters that I think a lot of people can latch on to. So yes, Rebecca Kuang's Poppy War.
Yeah, I'm going to confess something to everyone right now.
Oh no.
The Poppy War did not come to my mind originally when I was thinking of books to recommend. I know. And when you put it out there on the Twitter sphere, I was like, obviously, of course. I was almost like, how did I not think of Poppy War? It's right there, and it's a perfect recommendation. It's hot off the press. The last book in the trilogy is very modern. It's got this anti-hero protagonist in Rin. It's got, the very impactful scenes of violence and aggression. It tackles a lot of themes. It's subversive in the way that the author, R.F. Kuang, is writing this novel as a fantasy novel. There's a lot of really subversive, progressive ways in which she's telling the narrative. And that to me is grimdark in itself, when you kind of depart deliberately from these traditional fantasy tropes. And the Poppy War does that in spades. And just besides all of that, it's a really fascinating, exciting, fun book to read that you should definitely check out if you're interested in grimdark. It's a great place to start. Absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of things that people have on their minds these days with the things like colonialism, and it's very, and just the way that Rin is depicted is so psychologically interesting. I've recommended it to a lot of people, not necessarily as a hey, you need to start with grimdark, so start here, but just as an entry even to fantasy. I do check in. I kind of say, hey, have you seen Game of Thrones or something like that? And I'm like, how do you feel about moral grayness in your fantasy? And if they say, oh no, I'm cool with it, that's something I liked about Game of Thrones, I'll say, okay, I think the Poppy War will probably be a good fit for you. And I've recommended the Poppy War to lots of folks, even as an entry to fantasy, and I think if it works as an entryway to fantasy and it's grimdark, it's a fantastic entryway to grimdark.
Absolutely.
Which is a little bit less accessible than just fantasy overall, I would say, because there's a few things you want to be probably a little bit more niche and okay with, like this dark violence and moral grayness. So, yes, it's interesting. I don't know why it didn't come up for you and didn't come up for a lot of other folks.
So many authors have this narrative around them as being grimdark, especially Mark Lawrence and Joe Abercrombie. So Rebecca Kuang doesn't have that grimdark title around her, but she absolutely embodies it. So it's a great choice that I can see some people like going more towards traditionally who we've recommended for Grimdark, and not someone who just finished their first trilogy within the past year. So that's just my
that makes sense.
conjecture.
It's
I'm
definitely,
not sure.
yeah, who knows? Who knows?
But it's a great rec, and I'm glad you put it out there because I would have forgotten it, honestly. But it's so perfect for this. It's so perfect.
I mean, it's it because if we just went through all the recs, it wouldn't come up. But no. I felt a strong urge to discuss it, as I often do when it comes to that series. So
that's
I'm pumped we got the chance to talk about that and all of these other. Don't let the fact that I'm a little bit upset that Rebecca Kwong's work didn't come up distract you from the fact that I am ridiculously grateful for all of the incredible recommendations that you all gave, all the folks who came out to say what to check out if you're looking to start Grimdark. So if any listeners who haven't yet started Grimdark, I hope you got some great suggestions. I think you did, because there's so many places that could be an awesome starting point depending on your personal tastes. And yeah, thank you so much for coming out, folks who gave these recommendations.
Absolutely.
So awesome.
You guys are
sorry
awesome.
if we missed you.
Yeah, we tried to get everybody, but we've gotten to, but we're just so thankful. The threads become so long, and I can barely navigate the threads, as Dylan knows. So if we missed you, which is very likely, we missed somebody, and just thank you so much for your contribution, and keep it up. And these are some of my favorite episodes to make. We start to get a lot of regularly recurring people that we're starting to recognize. We're getting people that are pillars in the community coming out. And like you said, I'm so thankful, so humbled that people came out and give us these recommendations. And we've done enough of them now that certain authors are coming up that I don't know if I would have ever picked up without doing the show. And I'm eternally grateful for that. So guys, you are all awesome. Thank you so much for your recommendations. We love doing these, and I'm sure we will do another one very soon.
Me too. Yeah, I just love getting, even though it's just you and me talking, Charles, getting all these different perspectives.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's no way if we were left just to our own devices that we would have been able to come up with anywhere near the number of incredible recommendations that we got here. So
absolutely,
that's part of what makes these ones so much fun, is from so many different people and what they love and how they think about it, and even taking books that we wouldn't have thought of but that we've read, and then we're like, of course, like
yes
talking about, like with the 5th season, I don't know if I would have thought of it, but it's such an awesome rec. So thank you so much, y'all. And I think, Charles, all that's left to do is get that sweet outro music pumping at this point.
I think you're right, Dylan. So let's just go ahead and do it. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, if you didn't make a recommendation on this thread, but you want to drop in on the next one, or if you want to share your thoughts on what we've discussed today, the best place is going to be over on Twitter, guys. Twitter is the best way to reach us, and that's over at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. And we are on Instagram as well, another great place to go, at the FTF Podcast. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show beyond social media, and they just so happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Yes.
Just find that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app. Click the Friends Talking Fantasy page. Scroll down past all those episodes until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the optimal number to click to support the show would be 5 of them. If you have a little bit of extra time, the writing a review is extremely helpful for our podcast. But all that being said, just listening is more than enough. We really appreciate you doing that.
Just listening, guys, and leaving reviews and all this. You're all so awesome. We love and appreciate every single one of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.